My work has for some time now been a hybrid form of both printmaking, found objects, collage and assemblage works. And the use of symbolic imagery, things like maps, postcards and ephemera, has been more deliberate recently, and it's probably been the idea of in connection with my postgraduate studies, where I was working with these ephemeral materials as a very, very purposeful engagement with questioning post-colonialism and those notions of identity, and in particular the idea of I think a thread that's been in my work for some time is questioning this idea of what it is to be an Australian. You know, a very simple thing like a postcard. The reason for using that is that it's quite a loaded kind of object. It has an image that references notions of place, but also in terms of a European kind of perception, is that there's a certain ownership related to this taking of a picture of a place. And then on the opposite side, you've got language. And in terms of an Australian historical context, this idea of a European language kind of overriding the indigenous languages that were already pre-existing in this kind of work. That idea of the stories that we claim as our own and how these become our personal references. And then if we use those stories, once we put them out there in the community, that they change and they alter. And I guess what I meant by that statement, which is in the catalogue for mythopoetic, is the idea that mythopoetic is this idea of self-narratives. So I'm interested in this idea of our own stories and how those stories impact within the notion of history. We often think of history as this idea of a very broad brush sweep of society and community and what has happened in the past. And quite often I feel as though the individual hasn't kind of featured in that final story. And so the mythopoetic was a way of using our own stories and justifying our own stories within that bigger picture of history. And quite often it doesn't necessarily fit in with the collective idea. And Fable in brief, if you like, was just it's a description of what metaphor does. And I've recognized that in my practice, my method of working belongs to the realms of poetry, where it's not driven by a conceptual concern, so that it's more, I guess, about how one feels about a certain situation rather than what one really thinks about something. You know, when you think about the cognitive or the thinking about something, that it often evolves as a concept, whereas where you think about someone with an experience and you simply say, well, this is how it makes me feel, quite often that's where the poetic kind of layers exist, and the use of metaphor allows somebody to say, well, okay, I'm finding a substitution for a certain experience, and that leaves an openness about my work that I guess I recognize is very much in the realms of the poetic, and so that's become an important part of my practice.